We have Sarah Jenkins, Director and Principal Consultant, Jenesys Associates Ltd UK, an excellent science communicator and evaluator of public and community engagement initiatives. She's here today with us to let us in on the why, what, and how you can develop and evaluate your science engagement events and initiatives. I'm particularly excited for this session because I strongly believe that feedback and evaluation is one of the most underrated areas of a public engagement initiative that can be leveraged to upgrade your efforts and reap excellent results. Since 2006, working alone or with carefully selected associates, Sarah has successfully completed over 110 evaluation commissions featuring science engagement projects and initiatives of all scales, ranging from one-off events to international multi-partner programs. She strongly believes evaluation to be a process of reflection, development, and learning, and is dedicated to making evaluation appropriate, accessible, and meaningful to all the participants, ensuring that all stakeholders are given a voice. Welcome, Sarah, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Suchita, and good afternoon, everybody, or as we say where I am in Wales, Prynhawn da to you all. But I'm going to do some word association, which is a technique we often use in evaluation. And I'd like you to put in the chat the first word that springs to your mind when you hear the word evaluation. And it can be negative, positive, anything. But what do you think of when you hear the word evaluation? Scrutiny and check and impact. Learning. There's some really interesting words coming up there. And I suppose evaluation can be all of those things. But I'm really pleased that I'm seeing a lot of improvement. There is a sense of scrutiny and check as well. But what I would like to begin by saying is I would like to distinguish between monitoring and evaluation. Because monitoring is what we do to tell us about what we're actually doing. So it might be checking progress against our plans. Are we sticking to a delivery timeline? Are things happening when we said they would? All that information can be used in evaluation, but evaluation is a much more systematic approach to, as well as capturing all of that monitoring information, telling you something about the effect you're actually having. What I would like to say is it was great to hear Edward talking about the systematic way in which they evaluate their European Researchers' Night in Malta, and I think that is something that I'll pick up on later on. But we've obviously seen mainly positive words, I think, about evaluation from you. Now, what I could have done, and perhaps should have done, given that we're in this position, was put you into breakout rooms and use the technique called think, pair, share. And I mention this because this is a good way to get feedback from audience groups whose confidence may be lacking. It could be younger people, it could be people who are very unfamiliar with a topic, and they can talk to one another. So I would put you in pairs, get you to talk about evaluation in this case, or maybe about a science topic, and then come back and report to the wider group as that pair. So you're effectively interviewing each other. Obviously, I could do the word association, but the message I really want to get across today is evaluation should be embedded in your science communication right from the very outset. So you may have delivered a well-attended talk, you may have been to a well-attended science talk or science event, and I think what I'm saying is the event itself, very often people ask me, oh, can you evaluate this at the end of a project? Whereas I would say, let's think about how we're going to evaluate from the outset. There we go. Fantastic. Thank you. So we've done the negative and the positive and the words. We could have got you to check your smiley faces. But the next slide is really my general approach to evaluation. And there should be 3 circles here overlapping on impact. But really what we're looking at, I can still talk to this, is the broad approach that I use to evaluating science communication is I look at the learning, the process success factors and learning points, the outputs, the deliverables, the reach, who the audiences are, and I look at the outcomes, the external and internal benefits or changes achieved. Now, the emphasis on which of these 3 things we focus on in an evaluation will vary. For example, if it's a pilot initiative or something new, we may be looking more in depth at learning than we are at outcomes themselves, because it may be more important if it's a pilot or something you're trying for the first time to learn from the process rather than just judge the outcomes. Could we move on to the next slide, please? I said I was going to talk to you about why you evaluate. And I think your single words are covered in all of these things about proving or improving, clarifying your own objectives. That's why I'm saying evaluate from the outset. Impact was a word that we saw, demonstrating success. But what I want to get across here is that you don't have to do evaluation for all of the reasons stated. Prioritizing your reasons for your evaluation will not only help you plan it, but also ensure it's realistic and of practical value. As an evaluation specialist, you probably want me to, act as a champion for evaluation, and I will do that, but I will also say be very wary of over-evaluating. So I think when you're asking yourself, why am I doing this evaluation? What are my drivers and my motivations? Don't forget your other stakeholders. It may be a funder, but also the audiences you're trying to reach. It could be communities you're working with. So don't forget them in that way either. So when thinking about the purpose of your evaluation, who is it for? Next slide, please. I'm now obviously emphasizing evaluation as a tool for reflection and learning, and I don't think I need to add to this slide because of what Edward said in the previous presentation. I think he covered that. But what I do want to talk a little bit about is what good evaluation is and what good evaluators avoid. So we'll move on to the next slide. And I think the key thing here is that, as well as all of the things you can see in green on your screen as being the good things about evaluation, the best practice, it's thinking about the most appropriate way of collecting feedback from your audience. And I would say, based on the conversation I had in the chai session first thing this morning, sharing your findings with others is really important. And don't be afraid of sharing your findings if something has been less successful. I think that's really, really important. And so often I go in to see people and they say, oh yes, we've evaluated this. And they show me a pile of forms this large, but nobody has written it up, nobody's acted on it, nobody's done anything with it. So do share your findings with others. And in terms of don'ts, evaluation is essential, I feel, in science communication, because it's the only way we're going to develop as science communicators and develop our practice and develop as a community of science communicators. That bolting things on at the end should be forgotten, banished. Evaluation is a fundamental part of what you do. And I would say just don't worry about showing failure. Because I think if you present it as learning, it can be really useful. So there are some very practical, theoretical, I suppose, but practical do's or don'ts. And now I'd like to just return to the purpose. We're still on why we evaluate. Remember, I'm talking about why, what, and how. we're still on why, and there's a reason for that. Giving that emphasis at the beginning is really important. So why am I evaluating? Next slide, please. Who am I collecting this information for? Is my work funded? With the European Researchers' Night example we just saw, there is reporting to the European Commission. Are we really trying to prove what we've done? Is this summative? Is it looking backward? Is it often quantitative? We saw some graphs in Edward's presentation. Or is it formative? I talked about evaluating pilot activities or trial activities. And very often that shapes and feeds into what you do in the future. And there it can be really, really valuable to get qualitative feedback. So get spoken words, open questions addressed. At this stage, we're still really planning your science communication activity as well as the evaluation that goes with it. So now we've talked about why we're evaluating. I'm at this point in the presentation going to move on to what we're evaluating. But just before that, I'll just do a very short piece on having a really clear purpose for my evaluation. So if we could have the next slide. And this is really about the framework. This slide is all about the framework that sets the parameters around your evaluation. And as part of creating that framework, you'll be thinking about what you want your evaluation to find out and the ways you might show that you've answered those broad guiding questions. Very simple one example at the bottom there. Did the audience enjoy the science show? Well, you could do that through observation. Did they appear engaged? Then in a questionnaire, did they rank it highly in terms of enjoyment? Did they describe it as fun or enjoyable or comfortable? We saw the ratings for comfort. In terms of did they learn something? Again, a high ranking in terms of learning, but also in observation. Were they asking questions? Were they actively engaged in asking questions? And then were they able to describe something they learned or draw something they learned? You could do this visually. There are lots of ways, but that is the framework for the evaluation that we're going to do. And now I am going to move on to the defining the what it is that we're going to evaluate. So the next slide. These are all examples of real projects that I have worked on evaluating. And I firmly believe that every science communication activity can be evaluated. Hope Beyond Hype, which is above the word what on this slide, was a comic produced to help people understand the research that's going on around stem cells. And it was extremely successful throughout Scotland, but also used in European projects in multiple countries, so produced in multiple languages. If we move across from Hope Beyond Hype, we see a board game designed to teach young secondary school pupils, so they were around age 12 to 14, about cancer, some of the causes of cancer, some of the cancer research that's going on. And I heard again this morning earlier on how important it is to reach those young audiences. So that's being delivered in a classroom, in a formal environment. Then we have a bunch of teachers in the top slide who were on a training workshop to help them explain science to their pupils. And these are not specialist science teachers. These are teachers of younger pupils, aged below 11. So they would be teaching a whole range of subjects. But in their workshop that you can see this photo of, they were being taught about communicating science to those pupils. And then below that, we have a formal talk by a university researcher, actually working in collaboration, in this case, with some poets. So this was kind of a talk and some poetry. And I'm now going to move you back to the other side of the screen to see three things that were outdoor. And the top one of these is at a rural agricultural show talking about the planets and planetary science. Below that, we have a group of older retired people, the oldest of which was 94, actually graffitiing a wall in a city in Ireland with the visible spectrum, learning again about astronomy. And finally, at a community fair in quite a deprived part of the city, a communication project that was about robotics, and this involved a collaboration with puppeteers and circus performers to show that kind of show the sort of the value of robots and their potential societal value. And finally, the other three projects are all in where spaces where you might not expect to encounter science. One is a shopping centre where you have researchers talking about their work to people who are just doing their shopping. And it was in an area you can see with benches, so people might choose to sit down. So it was very much a conversational style of science engagement. And then the other two, the one with the frog on it is a poster on a bus. So that was around physics, and the idea there were questions posed, these very attractive graphics that then people might respond to the question online. There might be a hashtag they could follow up. So that's on a bus. And the last one is, you've probably heard that the British like their pubs. Well, this was a beer mat and talking about the science of liquids, and you could take the beer mat home and follow up and do experiments at home. So that was aiming at a sort of an adult audience up to the age of around 40. All of these have been evaluated, but each has its own specific characteristics. It will have a specific audience, a particular environment, and a level of complexity. It might be that it's a very short-term interaction with the science, such as with the puppet. So it might be you're reaching a very broad audience, but with a relatively shallow or focused level of science. It could be that it's a much deeper engagement, for example, with the cancer game. That went on over a number of sessions in schools, and there were other activities around it. So you were reaching fewer people with depth. But what I will say, all of these programs have been evaluated. Could we move on to the next one, please? And I'd like you to think about now what it is that you do in science communication, and what the sort of the topics are that you're talking about, the formats that you're working with, the particular audience groups you're trying to reach, where and how you're trying to reach them, and that includes online and in person. And then just broadly, those outcomes that you're trying to achieve. Is it about teaching somebody a new skill? The young person in the top slide here was somebody with a disability who wanted to design something that could help them drink a drink and rest their straw on the side of the drink, and they could use that when they were out and about. And so that was a skill, actually. They learned 3D printing and design. We have the very smiley person in the middle was at a zoological project happening in his own community, so identifying the species in his own community. And then finally, an exhibition, which just happens to mention India on it, but that's not why I chose it. I just realized that. That's actually in Yemen, and that was an exhibition around climate change. So there was a photography dimension, and I think that visual representation there was really interesting, because that exhibition toured multiple countries. and was able to have impact. People put other events around it that suited their environments. So I just want you to be thinking. This slide is to provoke you into thinking. And if we could move on, please, Shruti. Thank you. So we're still thinking about, we're still thinking about the what. And what I would say, when defining your what, it really helps in terms of the evaluation if you can transition from your broader aims into your specific objectives, because then that gives us something we can assess and determine. And I use the acronym SMART there: specific, measurable, agreed, realistic, and time-bound. Now, what I would say is I'm hoping that this presentation will be shared with you, because obviously we've got the problems of the communications between Wales and India this morning, so I will share everything with you. But I wanted to say the movement from inspiring more researchers to take part in public engagement, the fact we're going to train 50 early career physicists in public engagement and support them to deliver 3 successful engagement events in a calendar year, really helps me plan the evaluation. I've used the word success a lot, and success can mean so many things to different people. So if we move on to the next slide, you'll see that I've got a couple of questions there that will help you to define success for your audience. And you might think, oh, well, this is quite broad. Everyone wants to have an enjoyable experience. But actually, do you want to challenge people a little in that experience? Do you want that to be a two-way experience? Do you want to hear from people what their concerns might be about science, about the area you're... So, you know, thinking specifically about experience really helps. And what I would say, it's not just success for me. If I'm employed by an institution, or if I'm funded by somebody, what does success mean for that other stakeholder or those other stakeholders? So I think if you've got a project that isn't just you, or an SciComm activity that isn't just you, make sure everyone involved is clear about the overarching aim, but also their own particular success criteria. Because knowing this might not just help you with the evaluation, but it's going to help you select the right platform or location for your activity. And we're just going to move on again. Be good. The visuals on this aren't really working, so this slide has a triangle. It's another way of presenting the outcomes and the outputs. So what I would say is also the learning. Some questions to help you thinking about outcomes, to help you define success. What are your audiences, sponsors, or any partners expecting to get from their involvement in the project? And perhaps this one, given what you know now at the outset, when you're planning the activity, what do you hope is going to be different as a result of it? And outcomes can be short term. For example, the researchers learn, in the example I talked about earlier where we're training 50 researchers, they learn more about public engagement and science communication. Or longer term, they've delivered more public engagement or science communication activities, and those have been successful based on the feedback they've got from their audiences. So if we can move to the next slide, defining outcomes can be really complicated. And this is a model or a tool for planning and analysis that comes from the arts and cultural sector. It was developed originally in the UK for use in museums, but is now on the Arts Council England website. And I realise the link hasn't sort of appeared there, but again, we'll share all this with you. And what they've done is they've categorised the outcomes into 5 different categories. And actually, they cover an awful lot of what we're trying to achieve in science communication. It could be increasing knowledge and understanding. It could be changing perceptions towards something. It could be perceptions towards scientists. It could be perceptions towards type of research. It could be inspiring young scientists or potential scientists of the future. It could be also helping people to do something new, and you know, don't underestimate the value of science activity in helping people with their social and communication skills if you can get conversations developing around topics. But perhaps the most difficult is the bottom one, which is the behaviour and progression, and that is, you know, what people want to do or intend to do and their reported or observed actions. So that might be, you know, something they do as a consequence of what they learn about. But these 5 categories, the generic learning outcomes or the GLOWs, are really, really helpful in determining what it is you want your activity to do, but also helping you assess whether it's done it. And there are also social outcomes relating to stronger communities, better health and well-being, and they're also on the side. I'm now going to move on to the tool, which is the next slide, that I use when planning evaluation. I ask, who are my audiences? Who's being influenced here? And that could be multiple audience groups. What outcomes is this activity intending to have? And then I can determine how I'm going to measure if those outcomes happen. And the advice here is to be specific. I'm going to give you a real example if we can go on to the next slide, please. And this was a piece of aerial theatre. This was teaching young people about forces, the science around forces and physics. They were aged 8 and 9, and they were people from backgrounds who wouldn't normally have an opportunity to do something like go on a trapeze or to actually fly through the air. And that was part of the experience they had, as well as classroom sessions, to help them learn the science of physics. And what was great was the evaluator got to have a go as well. Now here, there was the broad outcome for the project. That's what's on this slide. These pupils have a more positive attitude towards science, but actually, to do the evaluation, we had to break those outcomes down more specifically. And if we go on to the next slide, you'll see what we were looking at there. Thank you. So the specific outcomes, we were able to see if they were using more positive words. We also tested their knowledge more about forces. That's further down the bottom. Were they more aware of forces in everyday life? Did they have more positive attitudes towards science education generally? And also the fact that they could potentially become a scientist, that people like them become scientists. So those were the outcomes that we were assessing in this project. And I'm going to move on to the how will come later in this presentation. And thank you for bearing with me. So that was what we did there. So the why diagram, I honestly can't over recommend it. You don't have to draw the why, but I think asking those 3 questions, who's my audience, what outcomes do I want to achieve, then you can answer the how will I measure if those outcomes happen. So you can start with a broad outcome like we did on the last slide and then define them more specifically. So we've done 2/3 of our why diagram at this point. And now we're going to move on to how are we going to evaluate. So we've done the why we're evaluating, the purpose, the what we're evaluating, the audience, the outcomes, and now we're going to look at how we're going to evaluate. So if I can have the next one. And really, this is deciding how we're going to get the feedback that's going to tell us if we've been successful, that's going to tell us what the outcomes are, if we've achieved those, going to draw out the learning, and are we going to collect this feedback qualitatively, quantitatively, both? You know, how are we going to do this? And what I will say is every single evaluation method has strengths and weaknesses. And ideally, if you could choose a mixture, that would be great, because obviously having forms can be very difficult if people are using English as an additional language, if you're using multiple languages. But what I will say is a good evaluation will find out not just if you met your outcomes, if you achieved your outcomes, if you achieved learning, etc., but also if your audience's purpose for engaging in that activity was met. So I've got a checklist of 6 questions that I ask when planning my evaluation, and they are on the next slide. Oh, they aren't on the next slide because something horrible's happened here. Okay, I'm really sorry, but I will talk you through them. So I asked myself, what am I going to find out? How am I going to use the evaluation information? Remember how you're going to use it. How are you going to report it? What resources do I have available? And if I don't have a lot of resources available, just coming up with 1 or 2 fundamental questions is far better than trying to do too much. Will I have time to analyse the information I collect? Could I work in partnership with someone? Are there ethical issues to consider? But I think what the really key things here are to make your evaluation as meaningful, practical, realistic, relevant as possible and proportionate. We saw in Edward's slide that they were able to do pre and post evaluation. If you're having a very short interaction at maybe a large drop-in event, do you remember my picture of the people at the rural show? They didn't have a long interaction. It wouldn't be fair to ask them something before and afterwards. You can't ask someone to complete a lengthy questionnaire if their average engagement time is a few minutes. Can we go back to the slide that wasn't working and then on to the next one, please? No, forwards. Ah, there we are. There are the questions. So that's what we've just been talking about. And it may be the working in partnership. For example, if you're delivering something as part of India Science Festival, what are they doing to evaluate the whole festival? Is there something you can slot into? You know, you maybe don't need to reinvent the wheel, as we say. You know, you don't have to do something again. Ethical issues can be around young people, vulnerable people, particular groups. And I would include in ethics actually making your evaluation accessible in a language that the community, that the audience uses. I think ethically it's important to try and offer a route to feedback in that language as well as the activity. So that's a bit about planning your methodology. If we can move on. And your sample. What I will say is very often in evaluation it's self-selecting, but you may want to intentionally skew or bias your sample. For example, if your event is for families, but you get lots of feedback from other people, it may be families that you target with the evaluation. So that's just some thinking around that, and there will be notes with the slide as well. So you might want a particular age group. And if we move on to designing your materials, and I think whatever you're doing, avoid the temptation to bias your... Can I take questions at the end? Is that okay? Is that all right?
Yes, you don't have to worry about the questions. We'll pick them up towards the end.
Okay, so it's not about balance, you know, it's about having a balanced approach. If you're going to ask people what was good, ask them if it would have been even better if they'd done something else. Think about your wording, and I think try and avoid ambiguous and double questions. You know, asking people, did they find something both enjoyable and informative in a survey or interview? Always try and use symmetrical scales. Don't have 5 choices for strongly agree or really positive and only 1 for not very much or not very good. And I think test your materials, if possible, with your pilot audience. And in the same way we co-develop science communication activities, we could develop our evaluation methods with our audiences too. And obviously online you can use all sorts of polling or surveying software. There's Mentimeter, there's Slido, there's lots of them. I'm not going to mention a particular one because it may be you already have a preference. But what I would say, make the language, I think, is the key thing here, making it accessible to people. And that target at the bottom was a different way of asking that, you know, on a range of 1 to 5, what do you think? So you've got a number of questions there, and people are just able to put a sticker in the target. So with 1 in the middle, feeling they most strongly agreed with that statement, and 5 on the outside, they least strongly agreed. So again, you've got a visual representation there. If we can move on to the next one and just move through. This was an online version of my word you associate with evaluation, what we did in the chat earlier, another way of recording it. Could produce a word cloud. So, and next slide. So I'm going to start with some quantitative stuff. Who's in my audience? You can take a screenshot, you can see the numbers if you're in Zoom, you can do observations, keeping account of numbers. I might want to know a little bit about them. How far have I reached geographically, their age range, what they're hoping to see. So you could have some multiple choice questions in a pre-event or a registration type survey. Moving on to the next one. These are just ideas. You'll all have your own. You can always have voting or multiple choice, and that target is a way of doing voting or multiple choice. You can use the emoticons, the smiling faces. That's a good way of getting yes or no or ratings of events. The statements, disagreement, again, that's really good for their experiences. Yes, they agreed it was comfortable, and we saw that in Edward's slide, but also their intentions. How strongly do you feel you will do something as a consequence of this or not? If we can move on to the next one. Graffiti walls, whiteboards, allowing people free rein to do something. And I saw a lovely project that was running for a long time in an offices in Singapore. And there people were invited to write on a post-it note and stick it in the elevator so that they were capturing visually what people thought or were learning. It was, the question was, what were you learning? So ideally, have your graffiti wall headed with a specific question and or maybe more than one question in different corners, and that's great for capturing thoughts, feelings, and you can get people to draw as well as write, so you're overcoming language barriers there. Social media, yes, your reach is easy, you can quantify that, you know how many people you're reaching, likes, follows, etc. But really, if you can do some analysis of the comments, that's fantastic as well. If we can have the next one. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but just if we move, these are some alternative methods: voting systems, tokens in a jar, dropping something into a receptacle about how they feel about something. So you could have 3 jars, good, okay, not so good, and ask people to drop tokens in that. Maps are a good way of finding out people's travel, how far people have come to an event. Handing out something to people, a small something like a sticker or a pen or an eraser or something like that, helps you keep track of numbers if you're in a busy space. So that gives you something quantifiable. You can have the next one. And again, I talk about your graffiti walls. Right, this is what I wanted to talk about. It's very easy to have a questionnaire, but that can be a barrier in itself for some people. So these are examples of us translating questions that you might normally see in a survey or a questionnaire into something that where people didn't have to write or click, but they were able to use a sticker. And we got people to these were laminated sheets and people stuck on them. Who are you here with today? Just me, family. And again, that was interesting because that was for a family event. So we can see we attract another audience. The 2 arrows at the bottom, I've included the 2 because one was about people's knowledge of science before today, a dot where they were on the scale. And when we're analysing this, we can break the scale down into 10 equal segments and see where people are. The one below asked them to rate an activity, and they were asked to put a dot on the scale as to where they thought it was. And what I will say with that one is that's a biased arrow because it's only got the arrowhead at one end. So ideally have the two-headed arrow. And the one in the other side, that was just a map. We wanted to know where people had come from for a particular event. And we also had a world map and got people to stick where their home countries were from, because we knew it was an area where we would have had quite a diverse community, and we really wanted to know which countries were represented. And because it was a European project, we also had the European countries in a different map, so we could see where people came from there. And that was really easy and quick for people to do. We had a whole sort of evaluation station and equipped people with their stickers, and that was a nice way of getting that visual impact. And we were able to include the visuals in the report, and it kept everybody anonymous. Can we have the next one, please? Some more alternatives. Obviously, another one that had astronomy as a theme. We asked people on each of the stars. This was a group of young people who were excluded from formal education. Very complex needs and backgrounds. Some wouldn't talk in sessions, some were elective mute. We had a whole range of things there. And we gave each a sheet of astronomy wrapping paper, as it were, and asked them the best thing, which was making my nebula. The thing that could have been better, and I think what's interesting in this case is this young person said if they could have said more in the group, so they reflected on their own performance there. And something that they learned, and this is one, the learning, which is the bottom star, was learning that Pluto isn't a planet. And that we photographed that, they took the paper away, that was their own thing. And the other example is my tablecloth. There's something, again, this example is people writing. They could be drawing on a tablecloth. Writing on a wall can sometimes feel quite formal to people because they see people doing it at school on a chalkboard or something like that. Putting a sheet of white paper on the floor and getting people to stand on it maybe where they think with, you know, how they feel about something, so you could put on it what different continuums you could have. I learned a lot, didn't learn as much, and asked people to stand on something or use it on a tablecloth. And this tablecloth asked people, write on the tablecloth what you'd tell somebody else about today, or you could do a drawing about what you'd say about today. And I keep these tablecloths because I think they're really useful for me in when I'm writing up notes and writing reports for people. So, you know, and you may get a lot of words. It's just a nice way of capturing qualitative feedback. So if we could move on to the next one. And I just wanted to show you finally what we did with my 8 to 9-year-old trapeze pupils. We did a pre and post survey and drawing with them, and the drawing was what they thought forces were, what they thought a scientist was, and we asked them to draw what they thought a scientist was thinking as well, and some of them put little speech bubbles, and most of them were big questions. Lots of them at the start were the very conventional scientist with the white hair and the beard that we saw earlier, and someone mentioned earlier in the chat. But there were also some of them who said, well, scientists think about normal things, and one had a shopping list and that kind of thing. We did snapshot interviews. These are really short, 3 or 4 conversational, not recorded interviews. And you can do them with anybody. And they're a really nice way of getting feedback in quite a conversational style. And you don't record them, you write up after each one. We did a focus group with the pupils here as well, so we were able to get longer term feedback. We went into the schools a year later, which was a real privilege and a rarity. But we also interviewed the teachers who were able to tell us what they thought the impact of this had been. And we did observations so we could see from those observations, we were looking things like increased questioning, increased confidence, and so we had an observation template really for that, and that may have answered one of the earlier questions. If we just can quickly skip on, presenting your data, that doesn't have to be conventional either. Word clouds we've seen. The coloured squares show different postcodes, different locations of people, so they could see the proportion of the students that came from a particular area. So that's some innovative ways of presenting your data. And the next slide is those generic learning outcomes again, because they can actually be really useful in analysing your qualitative feedback, like you might have on your tablecloth or your graffiti wall, or you've got in interviews. So they come in again then in analysing your data. And now we're nearly at the end. Next slide. Hopefully, and I really do apologise for the technological problems that we've had, but I hope I've given you enough to get you thinking as evaluation of an integral part of all your science communication, and that you will be planning it, making it practical and embedding it in what you do, and that you'll be asking yourself, why am I evaluating? What is it that I'm evaluating? And thinking really carefully about how you're going to evaluate. And I'm just going to finish with a top tip slide. I sound like a broken record. Planning it from the outset, use it to help and plan your activity. I think just don't measure what is easy to measure. Really look at the outcomes and learning, but be specific about the outcomes you want to record. Review and select the tools and methods for your specific activity, where it's taking place, your audience. Make it relevant. Make sure it works for them. And I will say, reading evaluation reports is a great source of ideas, but don't restrict your reading to science communication and public engagement. The NGOs, the charitable sector, they are always evaluating their projects, and I think you can learn an awful lot, and they're very often working with some of the more underrepresented communities as well, so you can learn a huge amount from there. And the other thing is, do keep in touch, and as I say, I will make sure this is shared with you. Now, how was I going to evaluate this session? Well, of course, if I'd had the luck and been able to come to India and see you face to face, I'd actually ask you to write a postcard to yourself and say what you're going to do as a result of this evaluation, of this session, something you're going to do. Ask you to make a note of it. I would take the postcards home with me and post them back to you in a month's time and see if you had done it. So I'd be following up there. I could very simply ask you the most useful thing, or the would be improved by that you could put in the chat. Or, and I'm not sure this is now going to work because of our technology problems, but let's try the final thing. Final slide. I could ask you to rate the usefulness of this session on Slido. You can try clicking, but I don't think it's going to work because it's not running on my computer. No. All right, well, what would have happened there was a QR code would have come up and you'd have been able to vote on that. So I realised that we're not going to score very highly. We're probably on a 1 or 0 stars for technological competence, or I am, so I apologise for that. But I hope that even though it's been a real race through evaluation, there are 1 or 2 real nuggets of information, real, you know, just something that triggered with you that you are now thinking about for your event. And that's why I said, if you do have questions about it that come up later on, keep in touch and we can find out, you know, help you answer them that way. So thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah, for taking the time and giving us a deep dive into how your methods of evaluation go about. And I think the examples and visual examples that you've shared during the presentation have just made all the information that you've shared more relatable.